Okay. So, welcome everybody. This is episode 2. Welcome to Rocko Talk. Today we have Dr. Jerry Gonzalez from Los Angeles, California. I went to El Camino College. Very highly decorated historian here in San Antonio, but also very well known across other places as well. He's an established author as well. One of his books that he's written in other studies, a lot of book reviews and other things as well. So I'm just getting into it. Dr. Jerry Gonzalez, how you doing?
Doing well. Thank you, Rocko, for inviting me to speak with you and speak to the folks out there.
Yes, sir.
I
Yes,
appreciate
sir.
the invitation.
Yes, sir. So just getting started, get the people a little bit to know more about you. What's something that you want them to know, your upbringing and where you from. Just tell the people a little bit about yourself.
Start from the beginning.
I'll up to you. You get a little something where you from, your family origin, everything. What got your passion into history,
Okay.
and everything. So we'll hit different subtopics and everything too.
Cool. Okay. So I grew up in a small little suburb called La Habra, California, which is about 20 miles east of downtown LA, right? And so if you know LA geography, metropolitan LA is just really a series of suburbs that are all linked together and then held together by the freeway system. Right? So that's LA. Um, so where La Habra is in relation to downtown LA is about 20 miles or maybe 25 minutes when there's no traffic on the freeways. Um, from East LA, it's east of East LA. So I live in that, or I grew up in that geographic zone that radiated out from East LA, um, which is traditionally the Chicano Chicana barrio of LA. But there are actually more Mexican Americans and Latinos outside of East LA than in East LA, right? And so that's the area of LA that I came from, that I grew up in, and I went to La Habra High School as a young person. Um, was a I'll just say it, a mediocre student. I was smart, I just wasn't engaged. Um, I knew that I always liked history. I was good at it. It was something that I enjoyed, analyzing the past, thinking about uh, the things that created the conditions that we were presently experiencing. I didn't have the language to put it that way back then, but I just enjoyed understanding how we got to where we were. Um, so, I was a fairly mediocre student. Um, I loved playing football, but I was probably also fairly mediocre. I was okay for what I was and where I was. Um, so I didn't have any offers to go play ball at the college level. I did get some interest from the local community colleges, and one of the community colleges that came calling was Fullerton College. I met with the coaches. Uh, they had this really old school, really great defensive backs coach named Alphonse. Um, I was going to call him Capone, but Fiola, El Fiola, and and I was sold. And the guy had, um, he just really sold me on playing ball there. And Fullerton College was close. It was close to my house. And my older sister had gone to Fullerton College. So I thought, well, I'll go to Fullerton College. So I started playing ball, didn't go to class, and was immediately put on academic probation at the end of my first semester. So I had straight Fs. Okay. Straight Fs. Yeah. Part of the problem was that I was too dumb to ask, and nobody offered the information to me, but the final exam schedule changed from the regular class schedule, at least at that point in time, at least at Fullerton. I'm sure it said it in the syllabus, but I was, like I said, I was a fairly mediocre student, and I didn't think to look at the syllabus, but I didn't go to my final exams, so I ended up with Fs across the board, including my history classes. So, um, needless to say, academic probation wasn't a fun place to be. It meant that I was ineligible for the following season. My coaches were not happy about that. More importantly, my academics were already way behind.
And I feel like,
Any questions?
yeah, I'm
Yeah,
getting to that. So
yeah,
like for that point in your life,
yeah.
you were coming out of high school, you say he's in community college
Mhm.
and everything. So you about how old? 19, 20?
A little younger, actually. I graduated when I was 17. I turned 18
Oh, wow.
the summer before I began community
Yeah.
college. Yeah.
So you feel like, at that point in your life too, you said how, it's kind of school wasn't really your focus in
Mm-hmm.
terms of names, a little bit more, being in the moment and all of that. Do you feel like that's something that, like, what was for you that really kind of sparked everything? Because obviously, you got your doctorate, you a historian and
Mm-hmm.
everything, which is was impressive.
Mm-hmm.
So, kind of being a 17-year-old, 18-year-old, 19-year-old in that moment, like, what was it for you that kind of sparked everything?
Ethnic Studies 101 with Jerry Padilla. It was the spring of 1997. So I was already on academic probation, right? Because I began college in fall of 96. Spring of 97, I walked into Jerry Padilla's Ethnic Studies 101 class, and it rocked my world because for the first time, I learned that people like me had a history in the US, right? Latinos had a history in the US. Black folks had a history in the US. Asian American folks had a history in the US. Queer folks had a history in the US in ways that weren't always reinforced in K through 12 history courses, right? Um, and so it was in that class that I really began to engage with these questions that were, at the time, I didn't know how important they were to me until they were, presented to me in the readings and the materials and discussion. Um, and that's when I started to make the connections between my family histories, where we were, and these longer histories that had largely been, um, obscured in the educational institutions that I had gone to before. So that's what turned it around. That's when I realized that this was something I wanted to do. Right. Um, I had always known I'm not going to be a pro ball player, but I was going to play as long as I could. Um, so my goal at that point still was to get a ride, go play somewhere, and graduate somewhere. I think in that moment is when I decided that I'm not going to get anywhere with football. I am going to get somewhere with my mind. So I continued to play ball. I played it out. Um, I've got a couple of stories if you're interested in that later. That how my career ended.
Yeah, we talk about that. We talk about that
Yeah,
later on. We talk about that later on.
yeah, we can talk about that. But that was all for the best because what I decided at that point was, to buckle down and do my work. Uh, I think I think after that semester taking ethnic studies and then continuing on with different courses in ethnic studies, I don't think I got any worse than a B in any of my courses for the remainder of my college career.
And what do you feel like is the thing that kind of really? I know you said that class was interesting for you, but just in terms of learning about, like you said, family history and other people's history as well, specifically in the United States, what the
Mm-hmm.
class was about. Why do you think that speaks to you? Because I know for me, myself, and I love learning about history. At least growing up, I did.
Mm-hmm.
And learning more about my family history and specifically Black people in America
Mm-hmm.
and other parts of the world. But what was it for you that kind of stood out? Because you're doing it for 20 plus years now,
Mm-hmm.
and what is it that continues to keep that as an interest for you?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. So the 90s were an interesting time, right? For especially for young men of color. They were dangerous times if you were in a larger city, right? Chicago, New York, LA, Atlanta. Um, the 90s was a pretty lethal decade for young men of color. Um, my my environment, my atmosphere was cool. I mean, it's not like I was my parents worked hard. They made sure that we had a roof over our heads, and we can talk about some of the stuff that happened there. Um, but trouble always had a way of finding young men of color out in the streets, right? So I used to like to go out with my friends, and we'd hit the boulevard, we'd go cruising. Uh, we'd go hit the clubs or backyard parties. Um, we used to roll party crews, um, and it was just a condition of the '90s that these things ended in I don't say always, but
Yeah.
um, it wouldn't be unusual if they didn't end in a fight or a
Yeah,
shooting.
yeah, something drastic.
Yeah, and so it was, I say it sometimes to some of my friends, kind of in jest, but also acknowledging that, hey, we survived the '90s, right? As young men of color, we shouldn't shrug at that. Like that was a tough time. Um, so understanding what those conditions were out in the streets, and then also, knowing a little bit about my family's history, but not enough, I began to draw some connections between the things I was learning in class. For example, one of the books that we read in Professor Padilla's class was George Sanchez's book, Becoming Mexican American. And it's a history of the first great migration out of Mexico into the US during the Mexican Revolution. And it follows the second and third generation and how they adapted to life in the United States. Right? And that spoke to me in a way because my family had migrated during that time. Right? I didn't know it at the time until I started talking to my elders, but it piqued my interest to start asking those kinds of questions, like, "Yo, when did we get here?" Right? What's our migration story? And as it turned out, at least on my mother's side, uh, in 1914, folks crossed the border, escaping the violence of the Mexican Revolution, and were there ever since. Right? Um, and so it didn't speak everything to what was happening in the '90s in the streets at the time, but it did tell me something about the folks who were out there, right? Myself included, my cousins, my sisters, um, and it just set me going on that path to asking those kinds of questions and trying to make um, that association between that history and what we were currently living.
That's deep. You got me thinking now. You got me thinking. Just in terms of that, so how would you explain kind of being, Mexican American? Just because it's such a deep history, and for myself, like I used to be ignorant about it. Like I didn't truly know, even in terms of my people, where I come from, where my
Mm-hmm.
people come from, let alone a people where, excuse me, it fits me definitely if I say something, but that it's stolen land. You
Mm-hmm.
know, Texas, Arizona, some Cali, Nevada, and all those, like those are parts of Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have a country here that they tend to try to almost have a privilege, but they try to strip people of that right, a feeling like like, oh, y'all came over here, y'all did this, when in reality it's a history that goes beyond borders. And so, like, how would you explain, or how would you kind of your advice for Mexican Americans and people of Latino descent, to kind of get them thinking and understanding that, a lot of the American fads and things in media is for to get you going to profit, but really understand where you come from, really get you understanding that, it's a deeper service for your last name, where that originates from,
Mm-hmm.
or where your grandparents came from why some of your people may not speak Spanish, or why some people speak Spanish and it's looked down upon.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a lot packed into that question, and it's a great question because you're speaking to how complicated it is to pin down any kind of group identity, especially Mexican American, and its relationship to Latinidad, right? Um, and and I'll say this: hundreds of books, thousands of pages have been dedicated to trying to understand what it means to be Mexican American in the United States, and we're still figuring it out, right? It depends on when and where we're looking. Um, you know, a Mexican farm worker in the 1920s and a Mexican industrial worker in the 1920s may have had very different experiences, right? They may have come from different regions in Mexico, right? their children might go on and do a bunch of different things, but then they're still encapsulated under this umbrella term of Mexican American, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of it has to do with the region and time and place that you're looking, right? Um, for me, in my little bubble in the 1990s coming up, for me, what being Mexican American was um, one, it was gendered, right? As a young man, I was very sort of egotistical in the sense that I thought about it, through gender terms. And then it also was heteronormative, right? Thinking about just sexuality as a binary thing, right? So that was my framing for that. Um, Obviously, that has grown the more
Yeah.
life experience and more studying I've done, but um, it, at that time when I was trying to develop this consciousness and trying to think through what was going on, it had everything to do with how young folks dealt with systems of power, um, and and it one of the most obvious encounters for men of color across the country, regardless if you're black or Chicano, is the police, right? Um, one of the lessons that my dad instilled in me as a very young chaparrito, I was too young to even learn this, but it always stuck with me because it's true. My dad always told me, be careful with the cops because they're a gang with a badge. And and that stuck with me even before I grew up into this little travieso in the 90s, encountering the cops, right? And so even if I didn't have all the language to speak it at that time, I understood that there was this power differential between young men of color and the police. And sometimes
Mm-hmm.
those police were also men of color, right?
Yeah.
But it was still a system of authority that didn't differentiate between folks.
Definitely. And why do you think that is though? Because like you said, for people of color, that's almost like a shared thing. Like it's like saying people say brown and black go together,
Mm-hmm.
but it's like a shared thing with police brutality and all those things. Like, why is that? That's the shared thing, and it's a shared trauma. It's a shared struggle. Like
Mm-hmm.
it seems to always be a struggle. That's something that's shared and
Mm-hmm.
that we have. Like, why is that though?
Mm-hmm. Oof, yeah, so it's got a long history.
Yeah, like it's a
Yeah,
lot to it.
there is, and so this kind of crystallizes my response to your original question, right? Which is what I recognized in that power differential, especially when the cops would pull you over, pull you out of the car, you know, pat you down, look in the car, all that stuff, was that I recognized that Mexican Americans are racialized people in this country in ways that are you know there's relational, um, I think, relationships with Black folks, with other people of color, right, who have to encounter the state and all of its different apparatuses. And so for me, being Mexican American meant that you were a person of color, a second class citizen in this country perpetually, right?
By what they said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what that meant then was I had to understand what those relationships were, right? That meant I had to read more deeply in African American history. That meant I had to know more about Native American history, Indigenous history, Asian American history, queer history, right? Because the way that those marginalized groups were created and then policed, and then the boundaries maintained by just everyday citizens, quotidian forms of exclusion, um, spoke everything to me about what it meant to be Mexican American and what my relationship was to other folks, and then what my responsibility was to other folks, right? Um, so I hope that helps.